I need to say this upfront. I don't watch football. I don't know the offside rule. I couldn't name you 5 players of the Argentine national team before I started researching this video. And yet, this week, my feed would not shut up about it. So here's a fact for you. You don't need to be a football fan to see that football is political. You just need eyes. Let's start with a live stream. During Argentina's match against Cape Verde, IShowSpeed, a streamer with tens of millions of followers who happens to be black, was filming from the crowd in Miami. An Argentine fan walked up to him on camera in front of everyone and told him to go cry at the zoo.
What are you saying? What are you saying?
FIFA had to publicly condemn it. That phrase isn't random, by the way. It's not even new. It's a very specific, very old insult, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly where it comes from and why it's been aimed at black players for over 100 years. Now here's the second fact from the very same tournament. Egypt was up 2-0 against Argentina, the defending champions, with 11 minutes left on the clock. Then a goal gets ruled out by VAR for a foul so borderline that former professional players were disputing it live on air in real time. A penalty appeal for Mohamed Salah gets waved off. Argentina scores 3 times in 13 minutes and wins 3-2. The Egyptian Football Association filed an official complaint. Mohamed El Baradei, a Nobel Prize laureate, said FIFA had lost its credibility. Egypt's own coach said he was done watching the World Cup, period. 2 things, 1 team, 1 week. Now even as a coincidence, referees make bad calls and fans say ugly things. That happens in every sport, everywhere, always. But when you actually sit with Argentina's specific history, who it decided it was, who it decided didn't belong, and who it has protected on and off the pitch for over a century, coincidence stops being a satisfying answer. This video is about that history, and I promise you, you don't need to know a single offside rule to follow it. In 1996, Argentina's president at the time, Carlos Menem, was on a diplomatic trip to the United States. Somebody asked him about Argentina's black population. His answer was direct. Black people do not exist in Argentina. We do not have this problem. Sit with that for a second. He did not say we have a small black population, not even we don't track that. He said they don't exist. That single sentence is basically the thesis of this entire video, so I want to unpack it properly because it's not just one president being careless, it's the logical endpoint of a project Argentina's ruling class built on purpose starting over a century earlier. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Argentina's government made a very deliberate choice about who the country was going to be. It waged a genocidal campaign against its indigenous population, euphemistically remembered as the conquest of the desert. At the same time, it threw the doors open to mass European immigration, mostly from Spain and Italy, explicitly to whiten the population and make Argentina look and feel like a transplanted European nation rather than a Latin American one. This wasn't subtext. Argentine elites said this out loud in policy documents and public speeches as the goal. Argentina did have a significant Afro-Argentine population, going back to the slave trade by some estimates. As much as a third of Buenos Aires was black or mixed race in the early 1800s. That population didn't disappear because people left. It was written out, undercounted in censuses, killed at disproportionate rates in the Wars of Independence and Paraguayan War, and gradually redefined out of the national story until Argentine and black became treated as contradiction in terms. Out of that same era comes the word cabecita negra, literally meaning little black head. It emerged in the 1940s, aimed at internal migrants moving from Argentina's poorer northern provinces into Buenos Aires for factory work. These weren't necessarily Afro-Argentines. Many were mestizo, mixed indigenous and European population. But the insult fused dark hair and skin with poverty and the working class into a single slur, one still used today. And that fusion is the key to how Argentina talks about race. It doesn't talk about race, it talks about class. Negro becomes a word for poor, not a word for black, which lets people use racialized insults constantly while genuinely, sincerely believing they aren't being racist because in their own framework, they aren't even talking about race. Diego Maradona is the perfect illustration. He was of mixed indigenous and African heritage working class from a shanty town outside Buenos Aires. Argentines called him Negro affectionately his whole life, but because he was working class first, that affection never had to reckon with what it might mean that Argentina's most beloved icon didn't fit the white European nation story it told about itself. So when Menem said black people don't exist in Argentina, he wasn't lying. Exactly, he was repeating the finished product of 100 years of erasure. And that's the foundation everything else in this video sits on top of. A country that didn't just fail to address racism, but built its entire identity on the premise that racism couldn't apply to it, because the people it might apply to had already been defined out of existence. That's the myth. Next, I want to show you what happens on a football pitch when that myth directly runs into a black opponent. In section 2 was the myth. This section is the receipts. Because it turns out the exact same insults comparing black players to monkeys has been showing up in Argentine football for over 100 years in almost identical form against almost identical silence. Let's start at the beginning. 1920. Argentina hosts Brazil in a friendly. Brazil's squad includes Afro-Brazilian players, which was itself a point of national pride for Brazil at the time. An Argentine newspaper runs a piece referring to the Brazilian team as macaquitos, meaning little monkeys. Several Brazilian players refuse to take the field in protest. This isn't a fringe blog or a random fan. This is the mainstream sports press in the very first decades of Argentina-Brazil football rivalry, setting the tone of the game. Fast forward to 1937. Argentina and Brazil meet again, this time in a Copa America final. Contemporary accounts describe monkey chants and racist insults raining down from stands throughout the match. So this isn't a one-off from 1920 that everyone grew out of. 17 years later, it's still happening now as a fixture to the rivalry itself. Jump to 1996. Argentina and Brazil are set to meet in an Olympic qualifier. Ahead of the match, the sports daily Diario Ole, a major widely read outlet, not a tabloid on the fringes, runs the headline, Que vengan los macacos, meaning, let the monkeys come. Both countries condemned it publicly. But think about what it means that a mainstream newspaper felt safe printing that as a headline. Not a fan in the crowd, not an anonymous account online, the press itself. 2022 Qatar World Cup. A chant starts circulating amongst some Argentine fans, mocking Kylian Mbappe's African heritage tangled up with a homophobic slur. It's worth pointing out that the chant also gets some pretty basic facts about French colonization in Africa wrong, which tells you it was never really about geopolitical literacy. It was about finding the ugliest possible way to other a black opponent. 2024, after Argentina wins the Copa America, a video surfaces of Argentine national team players, including Enzo Fernandez, singing a racist and homophobic song about Brazilian players on the team bus. It goes viral. And here's the part that matters the most. Almost nobody in Argentina's football establishment felt they owed anyone an apology, because if the country's founding premise is we don't have this problem, why would you apologize for something that in your own framework didn't happen? 2025 Copa Libertadores. Traveling Argentine fans are filmed making monkey gestures at Brazilian players. This time, Brazil's anti-racism laws mean something concrete happens. Several fans are arrested. And now, this year, Argentine player Gianluca Cristiani is accused of calling Real Madrid's Vinicius Jr. a monkey during a match. Brazilian and Argentine media covered the exact same incident in starkly different ways, which is exactly what the next section is about. Lay these side by side: 1920, 1937, 1996, 2022, 2024, 25, 26, and you're not looking at isolated incidents by individual bad actors. You're looking at more than 100 years of the same specific insult recurring on a fixed cycle, met every single time with the same shrug. So here's the question this section answers. Why does the exact same insult keep recurring generation after generation with basically no consequence? The answer isn't that Argentina lacks anti-discrimination laws on paper. It's that the institutions meant to hold the line, the press chief among them, actively work to soften, reframe, or bury these incidents instead. The clearest evidence of this is a direct comparison: how Brazilian media covers these incidents versus how Argentine media covers the exact same incidents. The Latin American Journalism Review has documented this gap directly. When a Brazilian player is racially abused by Argentine fans or players, Brazilian outlets tend to treat it the way you'd expect a serious institution to treat a hate crime. They name it, they cite the applicable law, they follow the disciplinary process, they quote the victim. Argentine coverage of the same event tends to do something different. It gets described as an incident or a controversy rather than racism. Sometimes the frame flips entirely and the accused player or fans become the ones facing unfair media pressure or exaggerated backlash, as if being caught on camera is the injustice, not the act itself. You can watch this happen in close to real time with Cristiani Vinicius Jr. story from section 3 earlier. Two national presses, one video, but two completely different stories. This is the mechanism that keeps the 100-year cycle running. It's not that nobody in Argentina sees these incidents. It's that the country's major institutions, its press in this case, have a built-in reflex to protect the national self-image over naming the problem. Every time that reflex fires, it teaches the next generation of players and fans the same lesson the last one learned. This costs you nothing. And once you see that reflex clearly in football journalism, it's worth asking how far back it goes and what else it's been used to protect. Which is where the video goes next, because Argentina's habit of shielding people from a reckoning with the outside world didn't start with football. So far, this video has been about football. This section isn't. Not directly, but I promise it connects. And once you see the connection, you won't be able to unsee it. After World War II, Argentina did something most countries didn't. Its own government helped smuggle Nazi war criminals into the country on purpose at scale. Historians estimate around 5,000 former Nazi officials entered Argentina through what came to be called rat lines, networks that provided false identity papers, safe passage, and often direct government assistance to get them out of Europe and into new lives in Buenos Aires and beyond. This wasn't a rogue operation or a few corrupt officials looking the other way. It went to the top. Juan Perón's government organized much of it directly, and Perón was not shy about his reasoning. He said openly that he considered the Nuremberg trials a disgrace, a case of victors punishing the defeated rather than real justice being served. Two of the most notorious architects of the Holocaust ended up there. Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief organizers of the final solution, lived under a false name outside Buenos Aires until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death who ran torturous experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, lived in Argentina for years, protected by the same networks. And then for decades, Argentina did to this history exactly what it did to its black and indigenous population. It shrank it down until it looked manageable. A government commission in 1998 put the number of Nazis who'd entered the country at somewhere between 150 and 180, a figure historians and organizations like the Cyber Wiesenthal Center called absurd on its face. given what was already publicly known about just the famous cases. It took until 2025 under the Milei government for Argentina to declassify close to 1,850 archival documents that finally confirmed the true scale of what had happened. Look at the shape of that story. Something enormous happens, the state actively assists it, and then for generations, the official number gets minimized until a small fraction of the truth is all that's publicly admitted until new pressure eventually forces a partial reckoning. That is precisely the same shape as Menem's Black people don't exist here. Different subject, same national reflex, protects the self-image first, admits only what you're finally forced to admit, and never all at once. Argentina's identity as the white European nation of South America wasn't just an accident of immigration patterns, it was a project. One, the state was willing to shelter literal architects of genocide to preserve. Once you see that, the monkey chants in Section 3 stop looking like isolated ugly moments from individual racist fans. They start looking like a symptom of something the country built into its own foundation and has spent 100 years refusing to look at directly, which brings us to what happens when the same reflex of protect the institution, minimize the harm, deny until forced shows up not in a country but in the organization that runs the sport itself. By now, the pattern should be familiar. An institution notices harm and chooses whether to name it based on whose comfort is at stake. Argentina did it with race. Argentina did it with its Nazi history. Now let's look at FIFA doing it with Palestine because the same reflex, protect the powerful, minimize the rest, shows up at the very top of the sport. Start with the comparison FIFA itself invited. Within days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, FIFA suspended the Russian national team and its clubs from all competition. No lengthy investigation, no years of deliberation, just a fast, clear, unambiguous response to a state waging war. The Palestinian Football Association has been asking FIFA for the same treatment of Israel for years, and the request has only grown louder since October 2023. The reasoning isn't abstract. This isn't a hypothetical harm to footballers. It's a documented one. The Palestinian FA has recorded well over 560 Palestinian footballers killed since the genocide began. Coaches, referees, youth players, professional. Suleiman Al-Obeid, known across Palestine as the Palestinian Pele, was shot and killed by Israeli forces last August while waiting for humanitarian aid. Just weeks before this World Cup kicked off, goalkeeper Salim Al-Ashkar was killed while getting out for cooking gas for his home. His own uncle, who sits on the Palestinian FA referees committee, said directly that FIFA's silence was hypocrisy. FIFA's response to years of this pressure has been essentially none. No suspension, no formal action, no equivalent urgency to what it showed Russia within days. That's not a subtle double standards. It's the same institution, the same kind of decision producing opposite outcomes depending on which government is doing the killing. Lionel Messi has on multiple occasions participated in events used for Israeli sports diplomacy. A 2013 Barcelona peace tour stop at the Western Wall, a high-profile 2019 friendly in Tel Aviv. Those visits drew real documented criticism from Palestinian solidarity groups who saw them as lending global star power to normalize Israeli policy. Put all of it together and the picture is consistent. FIFA is an institution that moves fast and hard when it's politically costless, and moves not at all when the victims are Palestinian and the perpetrator is a government the football world doesn't want to cross. So let's come back to where we started. I am not a football fan. I still don't know what the offside rule is. But I didn't need to be a fan to see any of this. I just needed to pay attention to what my feet kept putting in front of me. This World Cup, you'll see Palestinian flags in the stands, held by fans who refuse to let the tournament pretend nothing is happening a few thousand miles away. You see Egypt, a team nobody expected to trouble the champions, denied by a call that looked wrong to people who've watched football their entire lives. And somewhere on a team bus or in a stadium tunnel, you can be fairly confident a chant that's been sung for over 100 years is getting sung again. None of that is random. Argentina built a national identity on the idea that it had no race problem, and that same idea let it shelter the architects of the Holocaust for decades while insisting the numbers were smaller than they were. FIFA built an identity on being the steward of a beautiful game, and that same identity lets it suspend one country in days while ignoring another for years and lets it keep polishing certain stars no matter what follows them off the pitch. Football didn't create any of this, but it keeps showing it to you match after match, tournament after tournament. Who gets protected and who gets to decide which one you are. You don't have to love the sport to see that. You just have to be willing to look.